Think all 1960s British cars were timeless classics. Think again. Behind the charm of Jaguars and Minis lurked a lineup of clunkers that drivers wanted to leave in the dust. From bizarre designs to endless breakdowns, these cars missed the mark completely. Curious to see which models had British drivers sighing with frustration? Here's a list of the 13 worst cars of the 60s that you'd probably rather forget. We're taking a deep dive into a car that's often considered one of the most infamous failures in British automotive history, the 1973 Austin Allegro. This car was supposed to be the next big thing for British Leyland, the answer to the family car market. Designed in the late 1960s to meet the demands of the upcoming decade. Unfortunately, despite all the hype and the ambitious plans, the Allegro ended up becoming a symbol of everything that went wrong with British Leyland in the 70s. Why is it remembered as one of the worst cars in British history? When the Allegro was first launched, it had all the right intentions. British Leyland wanted to create a car that could rival the likes of the Ford Escort and the Vauxhall Victor. It was designed to appeal to the everyday family, with promises of practicality, reliability, and style. However, the reality of the Allegro was far from this ideal. Let's start with its most obvious problem, the design. The Allegro's appearance was, well, let's just say it didn't age well. The bulbous round shape was not only unattractive, but it also seemed out of place for its time. Designers may have hoped to achieve a modern futuristic look, but instead, they created something that looked bloated and awkward. The car's proportions didn't quite add up, especially around the rear, which gave it a saggy, disproportionate look. And that strange front grille. Was it trying to be bold and unique, or just confused? Either way, it didn't come across well with buyers. The Allegro simply didn't have the sleek elegance or the charm of its competitors, and it became the punchline of many jokes in the years to come. But of course, a car's looks aren't everything. So, what about the driving experience? This is where the Allegro's reputation gets even worse. While it was intended to be an affordable and practical family car, it failed to deliver on those promises in a big way. The Allegro's mechanical reliability was one of its most glaring issues. Early on, owners reported frequent breakdowns and constant trips to the mechanic. Rust was a major problem, especially in the bodywork, and the engine often struggled with basic tasks like starting up or maintaining power. For a family car, this simply wasn't acceptable. The reliability issues made the Allegro a stressful experience for its owners, who quickly learned that owning one was more about dealing with problems than enjoying a smooth ride. Now, let's talk about the most infamous feature of the Allegro. The quirky steering wheel. Yes, that's right, a square steering wheel. At first, this idea seemed somewhat innovative. Supposedly, the square wheel would improve the driving position and ergonomics. But in practice, it was a complete disaster. The unusual shape made it uncomfortable to grip, and it didn't make steering any easier. In fact, it made it more difficult. Drivers couldn't help but feel awkward behind the wheel, and the strange shape quickly became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the car. The quirky steering wheel has gone down in history as one of the most bizarre and unpopular automotive design choices ever made. To give you a real sense of what it was like to own an Allegro, I spoke with a few former owners who shared their stories. One owner, who had bought an Allegro back in the 70s, said, "I was excited at first. It seemed like a good family car, and the price was right. But after just a few months, I started dealing with rust, electrical failures, and the car constantly breaking down. I don't think I ever went a month without some issue. And don't even get me started on the steering wheel. It was a nightmare to drive. And after a while, I couldn't stand it anymore. I sold the car after only 2 years." Another former owner said, "I thought the Allegro would be a step up from my old car, but it was just a constant headache. The engine was always struggling, and the body seemed to fall apart faster than I could fix it. I've had better luck with cars that cost half as much." It's clear from these personal accounts that the Allegro failed to live up to its promises. While it was initially marketed as a practical, affordable, and stylish option for families, it quickly became a disappointment for anyone who bought it. The mechanical failures, the awkward design, and the infamous steering wheel all combined to make it one of the least loved cars in British automotive history. The Austin Allegro was a valiant attempt by British Leyland to create a family car for the ages, but in the end, it ended up as an automotive disaster, ugly, infamous for all the wrong reasons. While its quirky design and eccentric features may have had their charm for a select few, the Allegro will always be remembered as one of the biggest missteps in British automotive history. Do you think it deserved its poor reputation, or do you think it was simply a car ahead of its time? The Austin Allegro we talked about previously had big ambitions but ended up falling short in several key areas. The Hillman Imp. Introduced in 1963, this compact rear-engine car was designed to compete directly with the popular Mini, a feat that, on paper, seemed achievable. But the Hillman Imp's journey is a cautionary tale of how even the most innovative designs can be undone by mechanical issues and production problems. Let's explore why this little car didn't quite live up to expectations. The Hillman Imp was launched with a vision. It was built to be a small, affordable car, perfect for city driving, with a rear-mounted engine and a design that echoed the Mini's success. It seemed like a promising option for drivers looking for something compact, yet practical. The rear-engine layout was considered innovative at the time, and there was a lot of excitement surrounding the Imp's potential. But from the very beginning, things didn't go according to plan. One of the most glaring problems with the Imp was its engine. Unlike the Mini, which used a reliable and durable engine, the Hillman Imp featured an aluminum engine that was frankly too delicate for the job. Overheating became a major issue from early on, and owners were often left stranded with engine trouble. The aluminum engine was prone to warping and cracking, and many Imp owners found themselves facing expensive repairs, or in some cases, complete engine replacements. This issue of overheating was particularly problematic for a car that was marketed as a small, practical daily driver, something that could handle city traffic and long drives with ease. But in reality, it couldn't handle much of anything without breaking down. Performance was another area where the Imp fell short. Despite its small size, the Imp's engine was underpowered and struggled to keep up with its competitors. While the Mini had a reputation for being nippy and agile, the Imp just didn't have the same oomph. Whether on the open road or in tight city spaces, the Imp's performance felt weak and uninspiring. The handling was less than stellar, and the car's relatively high weight for its size only made things worse. Drivers expecting a lively, fun drive like the one the Mini offered were often disappointed by the Imp's sluggishness. But it wasn't just the engine and performance that caused headaches for Imp owners. The car's overall reliability was dismal. Frequent breakdowns became the norm, and the Imp's reputation for being a car that constantly needed attention began to spread quickly. Owners found themselves at the mechanic far too often, dealing with a range of issues from electrical failures to rust. And as the years went on, production difficulties began to take their toll, further adding to the car's reputation as unreliable. The initial excitement around the Hillman Imp quickly faded as more and more people realized that, despite its innovative design, it simply couldn't stand the test of time. I had a chance to speak with a few former Hillman Imp owners, and their stories are a telling reminder of just how bad things could get with this car. One owner, who had bought an Imp in the early 70s, told me, "At first, I thought it was a great little car. It was small, easy to park, and perfect for the city. But then the engine started overheating all the time, and I found myself stranded on more than one occasion. It was always in the shop. I eventually gave up on it after just 3 years, too many breakdowns." Another owner said, "I loved the idea of a rear-engine car, and I wanted something different. But the reality was, it was a constant headache. The engine was fragile, the performance was lackluster, and it just wasn't reliable. I ended up selling it for next to nothing." It's clear from these personal stories that while the Imp had some innovative ideas, especially with its rear-mounted engine, it simply wasn't a reliable choice for most buyers. The car's mechanical failures and weak performance meant that it never lived up to its promise. And despite being marketed as a competitor to the Mini, it never had the same enduring appeal. So, what's the legacy of the Hillman Imp? Unfortunately, it's not a particularly positive one. Despite its innovative design and the potential it showed when first released, the Imp is best remembered for its mechanical faults, lack of reliability, and production issues. It was a car that tried to offer something different, but ultimately couldn't deliver on those promises. In many ways, the Hillman Imp became a symbol of the challenges British automakers faced in the 1960s and 70s, a period marked by overambitious designs that failed to account for the practicalities of mass production and long-term reliability. The Morris Marina, launched in 1971 by British Leyland, the Marina was developed to compete with the popular Ford Cortina, aimed squarely at middle-class families looking for a practical, reliable vehicle. Unfortunately, despite all the anticipation, the Marina ended up as a missed opportunity, and its legacy is often remembered for all the wrong reasons. Let's dive into why this car failed to live up to expectations. The Morris Marina's story begins in the late 1960s, when British Leyland was searching for a car that could take on the Ford Cortina. The Cortina had become a staple in the UK, providing a solid option for families, and British Leyland was determined to create a worthy competitor. The Marina was meant to appeal to those same middle-class buyers, with promises of comfort, practicality, and a more refined design. The problem, however, was that it fell short in almost every area. Let's start with the design. The Marina was, well, bland. There's really no other way to put it. Unlike the Cortina, which had a more contemporary and appealing look, the Marina's design was uninspired. It was functional, yes, but it lacked character. Its boxy shape and conservative styling didn't do much to excite buyers, and it seemed to blend into the background of the automotive landscape. It wasn't ugly, but it was far from attractive, and in a market that prized both looks and practicality, the Marina didn't manage to stand out in any significant way. Now, when it comes to performance, the Marina also struggled to make a lasting impression. The car was designed to be a practical family car, but its driving experience didn't live up to the task. The handling was poor, with many owners complaining about the car feeling sluggish and unresponsive. The steering was heavy, the suspension didn't handle bumps well, and overall, the Marina was just underwhelming. For a car that was supposed to be the answer to the Ford Cortina, it didn't offer the same enjoyable driving experience. Instead of feeling agile and confident on the road, drivers often felt like they were driving something that was simply plodding along without any real spark. Of course, poor handling would have been forgivable if the car made up for it in other areas, but the Marina's performance was lackluster as well. The engine options, while varied, never truly impressed. The cars were underpowered, with sluggish acceleration and little excitement in the way they drove. For a middle-class family car, this lack of performance was a major letdown. Buyers were hoping for something with a bit more pep, something that could handle both the daily commute and longer family trips with ease. Instead, they got a car that was competent, but not much else. But perhaps the biggest issue with the Morris Marina was its reliability, or rather, its lack thereof. Despite British Leyland's efforts, the Marina suffered from frequent mechanical problems that plagued owners for years. The quality control was poor, and owners often found themselves dealing with rust, electrical failures, and other maintenance issues that weren't expected from a car of its price range. Unlike its rivals, the Cortina included, which had a reputation for being solid and dependable, the Marina's reliability was questioned time and again. For many owners, the joy of owning a car quickly faded into frustration as the Marina constantly required attention and repair. I spoke to a few people who owned the Morris Marina, and their stories paint a clear picture of why the car didn't live up to expectations. One former owner said, "When I bought the Marina, I thought it would be a reliable family car. I was drawn to the idea of British Leyland making a car to rival the Ford Cortina, but after a few months, I started noticing rust, and the engine didn't feel smooth. The handling was awful. It wasn't a fun car to drive, and it was always in the garage for one thing or another. In the end, I regretted the purchase." Another owner mentioned, "It was a fine car when it worked, but it always had issues. The performance was just disappointing. It never felt like it had enough power, and the handling was unpredictable. It just didn't live up to the hype." These accounts reflect the overall sentiment towards the Marina. It was a car that tried to be something it wasn't. It wasn't exciting, it wasn't particularly reliable, and it didn't live up to its promise of being a competitive alternative to the Ford Cortina. So, what's the legacy of the Morris Marina? Unfortunately, it's one of missed potential. British Leyland had the chance to create a car that could rival the Cortina, but instead, they delivered a car that was dull, unreliable, and forgettable. The Marina became synonymous with the decline of British Leyland's reputation, representing everything that went wrong with the company in the 1970s. The Reliant Regal, produced between 1953 and 1973. The Reliant Regal was a three-wheeled microcar that became famous not for its performance or design, but for its starring role in the hit TV show Only Fools and Horses. While the Regal is often remembered for its comedic associations, the truth behind its reputation is much less flattering. Let's take a deeper look into why the Reliant Regal was a car that, despite its widespread recognition, simply didn't live up to its promise. The Reliant Regal was a small, budget-friendly vehicle designed for people who needed an affordable form of transportation in post-war Britain. Its three-wheeled design was intended to keep costs low and provide a cheap alternative to the larger, more expensive cars of the era. It was light, compact, and had a simple, utilitarian design that was built to get people from point A to point B. But despite its practicality, the Regal was riddled with issues that made it one of the most unsafe and uncomfortable cars on the road. First off, let's talk about the Regal's stability, or rather, the lack of it. The biggest flaw in the design of the Reliant Regal was its three-wheel configuration. While this made the car more affordable, it also made it dangerously unstable. The Regal was notorious for tipping over, especially when making sharp turns or navigating uneven roads. It was an accident waiting to happen, and many drivers found themselves turning a corner only to have the car tip onto its side. It's easy to see why the Regal became a joke in British culture, with people joking that driving one was more of a balancing act than an actual driving experience. In terms of performance, the Reliant Regal was painfully slow. With an engine that barely produced enough power to get it up to speed, the Regal was sluggish in every sense of the word. It struggled to keep up with traffic, and its top speed was a mere 50 miles per hour, barely enough to keep up with the flow of modern roads. For a car that was supposed to be a practical commuter vehicle, the Regal was anything but. Its low power meant that even driving on highways could be a terrifying experience. As the car struggled to maintain speed or accelerate in any meaningful way, the Regal was also uncomfortable, and by modern standards, it would be considered downright archaic. The suspension system was basic at best, and the ride quality was rough. Drivers and passengers alike often found themselves bouncing along the road, feeling every bump and pothole in a way that larger cars of the time didn't. Inside, the cabin was cramped, with minimal features to enhance comfort. The seats were basic, and there was very little in terms of modern amenities. If you were looking for a pleasant driving experience, the Regal wasn't the car for you. But despite all of these flaws, the Reliant Regal became a part of British popular culture, thanks to its frequent appearances on Only Fools and Horses. For those unfamiliar, Only Fools and Horses is a beloved British sitcom where the iconic Regal is often used as the butt of jokes, with the character Del Boy frequently crashing into, tipping over, or causing trouble with Reliant Regals. This association with the show has largely shaped how people remember the Regal today. It became more of a punchline than a practical vehicle, and the public's perception of it was forever linked to its comedic appearances on television. I spoke to a few former Reliant Regal owners, and their memories of the car weren't exactly glowing. One former owner said, "When I first got it, I thought it would be a cheap and easy way to get around, but the instability was terrifying. I was always worried it would tip over, and the lack of power made it hard to keep up with traffic. It was slow, uncomfortable, and just not a fun car to drive." Another owner shared, "The Regal was a car of its time, but I can't say I ever really enjoyed driving it. It was too small, too slow, and I spent more time worrying about it tipping over than anything else. I had to let it go pretty quickly. It was just too unreliable and uncomfortable." These personal stories from former owners really highlight what went wrong with the Reliant Regal. While it might have had a purpose when it was first introduced, a cheap, simple car for those who couldn't afford anything else, it quickly became a laughingstock for its instability, slow performance, and poor comfort. So, what is the legacy of the Reliant Regal? Well, it's mostly remembered as a joke. While it was an attempt at creating an affordable vehicle for a post-war Britain, it failed in nearly every area that mattered: stability, performance, and comfort. The Regal's three-wheel design might have been a clever cost-cutting measure, but it made the car unsafe and impractical for everyday use. And despite its original purpose, the Regal became more famous for its role in Only Fools and Horses than for anything it accomplished on the road. The Ford Anglia 105e, produced between 1959 and 1967, this small, affordable family car was meant to compete with more advanced models like the Mini. But despite its distinctive styling, the Anglia was far less advanced, underpowered, and plagued by a number of mechanical issues. Let's dive into the story of the Anglia and explore what went wrong with this classic Ford. The Ford Anglia 105e was introduced in 1959 as an affordable family car that could appeal to the middle class. It was meant to provide practicality and style for families who needed a compact vehicle for daily use. The car's standout feature was its reverse-raked rear window, a unique design element that set it apart from other cars of its time. While the rear window gave the Anglia a distinctive look, it also contributed to the car's overall styling being a bit unusual. The car was, in many ways, ahead of its time in terms of design, but unfortunately, it fell short in almost every other area that mattered. Let's start with the performance. The Ford Anglia 105e was notoriously underpowered. Its small 997 cubic centimeter engine wasn't much to write home about, and it struggled to provide the power necessary for both urban and highway driving. The car's acceleration was sluggish, and its top speed barely exceeded 60 miles per hour, far slower than many of its competitors. For those who needed a car that could keep up with the flow of traffic, especially on faster roads, the Anglia just didn't have the performance to get the job done. When compared to the Mini, which was nippy and responsive, the Anglia felt lethargic and outdated. Speaking of outdated, that brings us to another major issue with the Anglia, the fact that it was simply behind the times. Despite being released in the late 1950s, the Anglia lacked many of the features and advancements that other cars of the era were starting to incorporate. Its handling was basic, with a relatively stiff suspension that didn't offer a particularly comfortable ride. The interior was sparse, with minimal features to make the driving experience enjoyable. While competitors like the Mini were offering a more refined and enjoyable driving experience, the Anglia felt like a throwback to an earlier era of motoring, with little to no modern touches to keep up with the demands of the time. But perhaps the biggest issue that plagued the Anglia was its reliability, or rather, the lack of it. The Ford Anglia 105e had a notorious reputation for rusting quickly. For many owners, the car was a constant source of frustration as they dealt with rust problems on the body, especially around the wheel arches, sills, and undercarriage. This was a common issue for cars of the era, but the Anglia seemed particularly susceptible. The rust problems were so severe that for some owners, it became a matter of when, not if, their car would fall apart. Couple this with the car's underwhelming performance and outdated design, and it's no surprise that the Anglia never gained the same loyal following as its more advanced competitors. I spoke with a few former Ford Anglia owners, and their experiences with the car echo these issues. One owner recalled, "I had an Anglia in the early 60s, and while I loved the way it looked, it was a nightmare to drive. The engine was too small, and it just didn't have the power I needed. I was always concerned about the rust too. It was practically a guarantee that it would rust out within a few years. It was a nice car in theory, but in practice, it didn't hold up." Another owner shared, "I remember the Anglia being a bit of a letdown. It wasn't the fun zippy car I thought it would be. It was slow, uncomfortable, and I had to replace parts constantly. And the rust was everywhere. It didn't take long for it to start falling apart." These personal stories highlight just how much the Anglia's issues weighed on its owners. While it had some charm, it was overshadowed by its many mechanical shortcomings and outdated design. So, what's the legacy of the Ford Anglia 105e? While it may have had a distinctive design and was a relatively affordable option for families, it is ultimately remembered for its lackluster performance, poor reliability, and the rust problems that plagued so many examples. When compared to its competitors, like the Mini, which was much more advanced in terms of performance, handling, and overall appeal, the Anglia seems like a car from an earlier era, unable to keep up with the demands of the modern car market. Its legacy is more about its quirky design than any true success as a family car. In conclusion, the Ford Anglia 105e was a car that had a lot of potential, but fell short in too many key areas. Despite its distinctive styling and affordable price tag, it was underpowered, outdated, and prone to rusting, making it one of the less impressive cars of the 1960s. The Austin 1800, also known as the Land Crab, produced between 1964 and 1975, the Austin 1800 was intended to be a spacious, family-friendly vehicle that would provide comfort and practicality for British drivers. However, despite its ambitions, the Land Crab failed to live up to expectations and became a symbol of British Leyland's struggle with both design and quality. So, let's take a closer look at why the Austin 1800 fell short of its potential. The Austin 1800 was introduced with a lot of promise. It was designed to be a large, comfortable family car with ample space and a smooth ride. The car's wide stance and boxy design earned it the nickname Land Crab. And while it was meant to be practical, the design certainly didn't win any awards for style. The angular, almost awkward look of the 1800 was one of its most defining features, and unfortunately, it wasn't a particularly attractive one. It didn't have the refined elegance of some of its competitors, and its somewhat clunky shape didn't do it any favors in the looks department. The car's design wasn't offensive, but it wasn't inspiring either. It was just plain. Under the hood, the Austin 1800 was powered by a 1.8-liter engine that, while not underpowered, was lethargic at best. The car's performance left much to be desired. Drivers found it sluggish and acceleration was nothing to write home about. For a car that was supposed to be a family vehicle, it lacked the oomph needed to make the driving experience enjoyable. It was the kind of car that felt like it was always holding back, and getting up to speed or overtaking other cars on the road could feel like a chore. If you were looking for a car that would give you a bit of excitement on the road, the Austin 1800 wasn't the one. It simply didn't offer the level of performance that other vehicles of its class did. But the biggest problem with the Austin 1800 was its quality, or lack thereof. As part of British Leyland's lineup, it suffered from the same issues that plagued many of their cars: inconsistent build quality and reliability problems. Owners of the Austin 1800 frequently complained about mechanical issues, poor fit and finish, and the car's overall lack of longevity. It was common for owners to experience rust, electrical failures, and suspension problems long before the car reached its expected lifespan. The car was prone to break down, and for many, the frustration of owning an Austin 1800 quickly outweighed any potential benefits it might have offered. I spoke to a few former owners of the Austin 1800, and their experiences paint a clear picture of why the car didn't succeed. One owner shared, "I bought an Austin 1800 in the 1960s, thinking it would be a reliable family car. It looked spacious, and I thought it would be comfortable for long trips. But the engine was so slow, and it constantly had issues with the electrics. It was frustrating because it was a car that promised a lot, but delivered so little." Another former owner recalled, "The design was odd, and the quality wasn't great. I had so many problems with it. Rust appeared early on, and by the time it was a few years old, it was falling apart. It just didn't have the durability I was hoping for, and it wasn't even much fun to drive." These personal stories reflect the larger issues that plagued the Austin 1800. Despite being marketed as a comfortable, family-friendly car, the reality was far different. The sluggish engine, uninspiring design, and constant mechanical issues meant that the 1800 didn't live up to its intended purpose. It was a car that had the right intentions, but ultimately failed to meet the expectations of its owners. So, what is the legacy of the Austin 1800? Unfortunately, it's one of failure, both in terms of design and execution. While it was a part of British Leyland's attempt to create competitive family cars, it became an example of how the company struggled with producing vehicles that could compete with the likes of Ford and other successful automakers. The Austin 1800's production issues, combined with its poor reliability and lackluster performance, ensured that it was never truly embraced by the public. Instead of becoming a beloved family car, it became a symbol of the problems that British Leyland faced in the 1960s and 1970s. In conclusion, the Austin 1800 is a prime example of a car that had a lot of potential, but ultimately failed to deliver. It was spacious, sure, but the sluggish performance, awkward design, and constant reliability issues made it a disappointment for many drivers. As British Leyland's struggles became more apparent, the Austin 1800 stood as a reminder of how not to build a family car. It's remembered more for its issues than its successes, and its legacy serves as a cautionary tale for automakers who fail to get the basics right. The Bond Minicar, produced from 1949 to 1966, the Bond Minicar was a very basic three-wheeled vehicle that became popular in post-war Britain due to its low price. But while it may have seemed like an affordable alternative to larger cars, the Minicar was a far cry from a practical solution for most drivers. So, let's take a closer look at what went wrong with this quirky three-wheeler. The Bond Minicar was designed to be a cheap, compact vehicle for people who couldn't afford a full-sized car. It was small, simple, and affordable, making it an appealing option for post-war Britons who were looking for a way to get around without breaking the bank. The Minicar was powered by a tiny engine, usually around 197 cubic centimeters, which made it extremely slow and underpowered. While it may have been enough to get from point A to point B in ideal conditions, the Minicar was anything but a thrilling drive. Its engine barely offered any power, meaning acceleration was sluggish, and it struggled to keep up with the flow of traffic. It was often a case of the Minicar holding up other vehicles, as it struggled to maintain even modest speeds on the road. But the real issue with the Bond Minicar wasn't just the lack of power, it was its three-wheel design. This design choice made the Minicar unstable, especially when driving at higher speeds or taking corners. With only one wheel in the front, the Minicar had a tendency to tip over, particularly if you made sharp turns or if the car hit a bump in the road. The instability of the Minicar made it a dangerous option for anyone looking for a reliable means of transportation. Many drivers quickly realized that the lack of balance on the road made it a very unnerving car to drive, and the risk of tipping over was a constant concern. Then there's the comfort factor, or rather, the lack of it. The Bond Minicar wasn't exactly built with passenger comfort in mind. The ride was rough, and the small size of the vehicle made it feel cramped and uncomfortable, even for short journeys. Inside, the cabin was basic at best, with minimal features to make the driving experience pleasant. The seats were sparse, offering little in terms of support, and the suspension was basic, meaning that every bump in the road was felt quite harshly. For anyone looking for a smooth and comfortable ride, the Minicar was far from ideal. So why did the Bond Minicar become so popular, despite all these issues? Well, it was primarily due to its low cost. The Minicar was dirt cheap compared to full-sized cars, which made it an attractive option for people who were on a tight budget. However, once more practical and safer small cars entered the market in the 1960s, the Bond Minicar quickly became obsolete. It simply couldn't compete with the more advanced, more stable, and more comfortable cars that were being produced at the time. I spoke to a few former Bond Minicar owners, and their experiences highlight just how impractical this little three-wheeler was. One former owner said, "I had a Minicar in the early 1960s, and while it was cheap, it was honestly terrifying to drive. It was so unstable, I was always worried it would tip over, especially when I took a turn too fast. The engine was so small, it felt like it could barely keep up with traffic. It wasn't a fun car at all." Another owner shared, "It was fun at first, just because it was so different from anything else on the road. But the reality was that it was just too small and too unstable. It didn't last long for me. I wanted something that was safer and had more power." These stories reflect the common experience with the Bond Minicar. While it may have seemed like an affordable, quirky solution for cheap transportation, it was ultimately impractical, unsafe, and uncomfortable. Its tiny engine, three-wheeled instability, and basic design made it far from a viable long-term option for most drivers. So, what is the legacy of the Bond Minicar? Today, it's mostly seen as a novelty, a relic of a time when cheap small vehicles were in high demand. While the Minicar was once a popular choice for drivers looking to save money, it was soon overshadowed by more advanced and practical vehicles that offered better performance, stability, and comfort. Now, the Minicar is often remembered more for its unusual design and quirky history than for its practical applications on the road. In conclusion, the Bond Minicar was a car that, while cheap and simple, didn't hold up in terms of performance or safety. Its tiny engines, three-wheeled instability, and uncomfortable ride made it an impractical choice for many drivers. And as more practical small cars emerged in the 1960s, the Minicar quickly became obsolete. While it may still hold some nostalgic charm for car enthusiasts today, it was ultimately a car that served a brief, niche role before being outclassed by more reliable and safer vehicles. The Austin A40 Farina. Produced from 1958 to 1967, the A40 Farina was one of the early British attempts at a hatchback aimed at the economy segment. While it had some innovative features, the car ultimately struggled with performance, handling, and appeal, failing to leave a lasting impression on the automotive world. So, let's take a closer look at the Austin A40 Farina and explore why it didn't live up to its promise. First, let's talk about the design. The A40 Farina was a relatively early example of a hatchback, a body style that would go on to become hugely popular in the years to come. It was designed with practicality in mind, offering a compact body and a decent amount of boot space thanks to its rear hatch. At the time, this was a relatively novel feature, and it was part of the car's appeal for buyers looking for something both small and practical. However, while the hatchback design was innovative for its time, the overall styling of the A40 Farina was quite plain and uninspiring. Its body was boxy and unremarkable, and while it wasn't unattractive, it also didn't do much to stand out in the crowded economy car market. Under the hood, the A40 Farina was powered by a 1.0-liter engine, which, while perfectly adequate for a small car, was underpowered when it came to providing any real excitement behind the wheel. The car's performance was disappointing, and its engine struggled to provide the punch that many drivers expected, especially on longer trips or when trying to overtake on highways. The A40 Farina's engine was fine for city driving, but it lacked the oomph necessary for more demanding driving situations. This left the car feeling sluggish and uninspiring, especially when compared to some of the competition in the same price bracket. Perhaps the biggest letdown with the Austin A40 Farina was its handling. Despite being a relatively compact car, the A40 Farina wasn't particularly agile or responsive on the road. Its suspension was rather basic, and the steering felt heavy and unresponsive, making the car difficult to handle at higher speeds or on winding roads. Drivers often complained about the lack of road feel, and the car's handling was often described as clumsy and awkward, which made it a less enjoyable driving experience than other cars in its class. I spoke with a few former owners of the Austin A40 Farina, and their experiences echo these issues. One owner recalled, I had an A40 Farina in the 1960s, and while it was a decent little car, it never felt very exciting to drive. The engine was weak, and the handling was a real letdown. It wasn't terrible, but it just wasn't much fun to drive either. Another owner shared, "It was a practical car, but that's about it. The hatchback was a nice feature, but the engine was underwhelming, and the car didn't feel very stable on the road. For the price, you could get something a lot more fun to drive." These stories highlight the core issues that held the A40 Farina back. While it had some innovative ideas such as the hatchback design, it was ultimately let down by poor performance, uninspiring handling, and a lack of excitement behind the wheel. The car's design, while practical, failed to stand out in a competitive market where buyers were looking for something more engaging and dynamic. So, what is the legacy of the Austin A40 Farina? While it was a part of the early hatchback movement and provided a practical option for buyers in the economy segment, it ultimately failed to gain the attention and appeal that other cars in its class did. It was overshadowed by more refined and exciting options, and its lack of performance and handling issues meant that it never quite captured the public's imagination. The A40 Farina's legacy is one of missed potential. While it had innovative features, it didn't do enough to make a real impact on the market. In conclusion, the Austin A40 Farina was a car that had some forward-thinking ideas, but it ultimately fell short in execution. Despite being one of the early hatchbacks, it suffered from poor handling, weak engines, and a lack of excitement that left it struggling in a competitive market. While it may have appealed to those looking for a practical and affordable option, it didn't offer enough to stand out and remain memorable in the automotive world. The Rover P6 2000 Automatic. Produced between 1963 and 1977, the Rover P6 was a well-regarded model that impressed many with its engineering, styling, and performance. But the automatic transmission variant was plagued by reliability issues. Let's take a closer look at why the P6 2000 Automatic failed to live up to the P6's solid reputation and left a sour taste for many owners. The Rover P6, as a whole, was a car ahead of its time. It was designed with a distinctive and modern appearance, offering a comfortable and refined driving experience. The manual version of the P6, with its well-engineered suspension and responsive handling, was praised for its performance and durability. It was considered one of the best executive cars of its time, and many saw it as a direct competitor to cars like the Jaguar and BMW. However, when Rover introduced the automatic version of the P6 2000, things started to go downhill. The automatic transmission, while a feature that many drivers appreciated for convenience, was prone to a host of issues that ultimately made it a headache for owners. Unlike the smooth, reliable transmissions of its competitors, the P6's automatic gearbox was notoriously unreliable. It would frequently fail, leading to expensive repairs and causing frustration for anyone who opted for the automatic over the manual version. What made the automatic version even more troublesome was the P6's complex engineering. Rover had created a car with advanced features, but this sophistication also meant that when things went wrong, repairs could be costly and complicated. The automatic transmission wasn't just an easy fix. It often required specialized knowledge and parts to get the car back on the road, and this translated to a significant expense for owners. As a result, the P6 2000 Automatic became known for being high maintenance, and many people quickly regretted choosing the automatic version over the manual. I spoke with a few former owners of the Rover P6 2000 Automatic, and their experiences paint a picture of just how problematic the automatic gearbox could be. One owner shared, "I loved my P6 when I bought it. It was stylish and comfortable, and I was looking forward to the automatic transmission for the ease of driving, but it didn't take long before the gearbox started giving me trouble. It was always slipping or getting stuck, and eventually, I had to replace it, which cost a small fortune. I ended up switching to a manual version, which was much more reliable." Another owner explained, "The automatic version of the P6 had such a bad reputation in our community. Everyone I knew who had faced gearbox issues. It was a beautiful car, but the constant breakdowns made it a nightmare to own." These personal stories highlight the key issue with the Rover P6 2000 Automatic: the unreliable transmission. The manual version of the P6 continued to enjoy popularity throughout its production run, thanks to its solid engineering and dependable performance. But for the automatic version, the reputation was tarnished by a series of technical issues that left many owners frustrated and disappointed. So, what is the legacy of the Rover P6 2000 Automatic? The P6 itself is still remembered fondly for its sleek design, advanced features, and solid performance, especially in the manual variants. However, the automatic version, unfortunately, is often seen as a cautionary tale of how a good car can be undone by a problematic component. The P6 2000 Automatic became notorious for its unreliable gearbox and high repair costs. And for many owners, it was a far cry from the reliable and enjoyable driving experience they'd hoped for. In conclusion, the Rover P6 2000 Automatic is a perfect example of how a well-regarded car can fall short when one crucial component fails to meet expectations. While the P6 was admired for its engineering and design, the automatic transmission was riddled with issues that soured the ownership experience for many. The legacy of the Rover P6 2000 Automatic is one of disappointment, with many owners wishing they had gone for the more reliable manual version instead. The Vauxhall Victor, produced from 1961 to 1978. The Victor was meant to compete with other mid-sized sedans of the era, offering families a reliable and affordable option for everyday driving. But the Victor's reputation suffered a serious blow, particularly in its early models, thanks to one major flaw that earned it an infamous nickname: the Vauxhall Rotbox. Let's dive into why the Vauxhall Victor's legacy is so tarnished, and why it's often seen as one of the least durable British cars. The Vauxhall Victor was initially introduced as a modern, practical family car, designed to compete with rivals like the Ford Cortina and the Morris Marina. It offered good space, a decent level of comfort, and a range of engine options that made it suitable for families on a budget. At first, the car seemed promising, and it even had some strong points, such as a smooth ride and relatively decent handling for its time. However, these positives quickly became overshadowed by one glaring issue: rust. The early 1960s models of the Vauxhall Victor were particularly prone to rust, and it wasn't just a minor issue. It was a massive problem that affected the entire car. The body panels, the underside, and even areas around the wheel arches would rust out at alarming rates. Many owners reported that their cars began to corrode almost as soon as they were out of the showroom. This chronic rust problem earned the Vauxhall Victor the unflattering nickname Vauxhall Rotbox, and it was a reputation the car couldn't shake off for the rest of its production run. The rust issues were so severe that it became a constant headache for Victor owners, who had to deal with extensive bodywork repairs, frequent undercoating treatments, and even full panel replacements in some cases. And as we all know, rust isn't just an aesthetic problem. It can weaken the structural integrity of the car, which makes it unsafe and difficult to drive. So it's no surprise that many owners became frustrated with how quickly their cars deteriorated despite regular maintenance. But it wasn't just the rust that let the Vauxhall Victor down. While the car offered a smooth and comfortable ride, its handling and overall performance were somewhat lackluster compared to its competitors. The Victor's steering could be heavy, and the car's suspension wasn't particularly refined, making it less enjoyable to drive than other cars in the same category. Additionally, the engines, while adequate, didn't deliver the power or efficiency that many buyers expected from a family car. It was a car that did the job, but just barely. And when combined with the constant rust issues, it didn't exactly win over a loyal following. I spoke with a few former Vauxhall Victor owners, and their stories reflect just how serious the rust problem was. One former owner said, "I had a 1963 Victor, and within just a few years, I noticed rust starting to appear all over it. By the time I sold it, it was practically falling apart. It was a shame because the car had plenty of space, but the rust really ruined it for me." Another owner shared, "I loved the ride and comfort of the Victor, but the rust just wouldn't stop. I had to replace the wheel arches twice, and I spent a fortune on bodywork. It was a great car in theory, but not when it came to the long-term durability." These personal accounts really bring home how significant the rust problem was for the Vauxhall Victor. While the car might have had some positive attributes, the corrosion issues made it unreliable and costly to maintain. And unfortunately, that became its defining characteristic for many people. So, what is the legacy of the Vauxhall Victor? While the car had some good qualities in terms of comfort and practicality, its tendency to rust severely overshadowed any positive features it had. The Vauxhall Rotbox nickname stuck for a reason. Its reputation for corrosion tarnished its standing in the market and left many drivers with lasting frustration. The Victor became known not for its performance or innovation, but for its inability to stand the test of time, especially when it came to durability. In conclusion, the Vauxhall Victor was a car that could have been a solid competitor in the mid-sized family car market. but its notorious rust issues and lackluster performance doomed it in the long run. Despite its comfort and space, the Victor's legacy is defined by its premature decay, leaving it as one of the least durable British cars ever produced. The Ford Corsair. Produced between 1963 and 1970, the Corsair was meant to slot in between the more popular Ford Cortina and the larger Zephyr, with its distinctively American-inspired styling and a promise of providing a balance between compact and executive-sized sedans. The Corsair had all the makings of a successful model. Unfortunately, it didn't quite live up to expectations. Let's explore why the Ford Corsair never quite reached the popularity it was hoping for, and why it became known more for its mechanical issues and awkward design than anything else. When the Ford Corsair first hit the market, it was positioned as a mid-sized family car that would sit neatly between the Cortina and Zephyr. The idea was that the Corsair would offer more space and power than the Cortina, but remain more manageable than the larger Zephyr. On paper, it sounded like a good plan. However, the Corsair quickly ran into problems that kept it from reaching the popularity that other Ford models enjoyed during the 1960s. Let's start with the design. The Corsair's styling was, well, unique. While Ford tried to give the car a distinctive, American-inspired look, with a long, sleek bonnet and a relatively wide stance, it ended up feeling a bit awkward. The proportions seemed off, and the car's narrow design, especially in the rear, didn't help its appearance. It had a bit of an elongated and slightly cramped feel, especially when compared to its competitors. While the front of the car had a bold American muscle car vibe, the rear felt narrow and unbalanced, creating an odd visual tension. To put it simply, the Corsair was a car that didn't quite know what it wanted to be. But it wasn't just the styling that let the Corsair down. The driving experience was also a letdown for many owners. The handling was often described as poor, with the car feeling unstable and difficult to maneuver. The suspension didn't provide the level of comfort you'd expect from a mid-sized car, and the steering was heavy and unresponsive, making it a challenge to drive, especially at higher speeds. The Corsair's handling issues made it less enjoyable to drive than other models in the same price range, and this ultimately turned a lot of potential customers away. In addition to its awkward design and handling problems, the Ford Corsair suffered from its share of mechanical reliability issues. The car was known to have engine troubles, and many owners reported frequent breakdowns, particularly with the early models. Whether it was issues with the gearbox, suspension, or electrical components, the Corsair seemed to have a knack for disappointing drivers when it came to reliability. This further tarnished its reputation and meant that even those who might have liked the car's concept were often left frustrated by its performance. I spoke with a few former Ford Corsair owners, and their experiences highlight just how frustrating the car could be to own. One former owner shared, "I bought a Corsair in the 1960s, and while I thought it looked cool, I quickly realized it wasn't a very good car to drive. The handling was awful, and I had to take it to the mechanic more times than I care to remember. I loved the idea of the car, but it just didn't deliver." Another owner recalled, "I remember the narrow back end and the strange way it felt on the road. It was never as smooth or as comfortable as I wanted, and reliability was always an issue. It was one of those cars that I just couldn't trust." These stories reflect the main issues that plagued the Ford Corsair: its unbalanced design, poor handling, and reliability problems. It seemed to struggle in all the areas that mattered most to drivers, from styling to performance to dependability, which made it hard for the Corsair to compete against more popular and reliable models in Ford's own lineup, like the Cortina. So, what is the legacy of the Ford Corsair? The Corsair's awkward styling, combined with its handling and mechanical issues, meant that it never quite earned the recognition or following of other Ford models from the era. While Ford had success with the Cortina and Zephyr, the Corsair faded into the background as a bit of an oddball in the family sedan market. It's a car that tried to offer something new, but ultimately fell short in execution, leaving it with a legacy of being a forgotten model in Ford's history. In conclusion, the Ford Corsair's attempt to bridge the gap between the Cortina and the Zephyr ended up missing the mark in several key areas. Its strange design, poor handling, and mechanical problems made it hard for the Corsair to gain the attention and popularity it deserved. While it had potential, it ultimately became known as a car that just couldn't quite get it right. The Singer Gazelle Series 5, produced between 1960 and 1967, the Gazelle was intended to appeal to buyers looking for a more refined, compact car. But despite its ambitions, the Gazelle ended up being more forgettable than it was impressive, overshadowed by more popular models from competitors like BMC and Ford. Let's dive into why the Singer Gazelle Series 5 failed to make a lasting impact and became one of those cars that's largely forgotten today. When the Singer Gazelle was introduced, it was marketed as an upscale alternative to the many compact cars flooding the market in the 1960s. It was designed to offer more luxury and refinement than some of the entry-level options available at the time, while still being affordable for the average buyer. But while the idea of a more premium compact car was appealing, the Gazelle didn't quite live up to its potential. First off, let's talk about the styling. The Gazelle Series 5 was certainly a car of its time, but unfortunately, it was very plain and uninspiring compared to its competitors. The exterior design was boxy and conservative, lacking any real flair or distinction. Unlike other cars from the era, which were experimenting with bolder lines and unique profiles, the Gazelle didn't stand out in a crowd. It didn't offer anything particularly special to excite potential buyers. While it wasn't necessarily unattractive, it certainly didn't evoke any sense of excitement or desire. In an era when cars like the Mini and the Ford Cortina were capturing attention, the Gazelle's bland appearance made it hard to compete. But styling wasn't the only problem with the Gazelle. It also suffered from reliability issues, which seriously tarnished its reputation. While the Gazelle was intended to be an upscale vehicle, it didn't have the mechanical quality to back up its claims. Owners reported frequent breakdowns and mechanical failures, from engine problems to issues with the suspension. Many of these issues seemed to be related to poor build quality, which was a significant issue for a car that was supposed to be a more refined option. The Gazelle's mechanical shortcomings made it less attractive to potential buyers, who turned to more reliable models from the likes of Ford or BMC, who were producing cars with better reputations for durability. I spoke with a few former owners of the Singer Gazelle, and their stories paint a picture of a car that promised much but failed to deliver. One former owner shared, "I had a Gazelle Series 5 in the mid-60s, and while it looked decent, it was always in the shop. Engine trouble, suspension issues. It was just one thing after another. I wanted to love it, but it just wasn't reliable." Another owner recalled, "It wasn't a bad car, but it was definitely overshadowed by everything else on the market. I could never get excited about it. It just didn't have that special something." These personal accounts reflect the main issues with the Gazelle. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't particularly good either. It failed to stand out in terms of design, and its reliability issues made it less appealing than its more popular competitors. So, what is the legacy of the Singer Gazelle Series 5? Unfortunately, it's a bit of a forgotten car. While it tried to position itself as a premium compact option, it ultimately got lost in the shuffle, overshadowed by better offerings from BMC, Ford, and other manufacturers. Its styling wasn't striking enough to make an impact, and its reliability issues kept it from being a dependable choice for buyers. Over time, the Gazelle faded into obscurity, and today, it's largely forgotten by automotive enthusiasts, often seen as a missed opportunity. In conclusion, the Singer Gazelle Series 5 is a reminder that even when a car is trying to fill a niche in the market, it still needs to bring something unique to the table. Whether it's through design, performance, or reliability, the Gazelle simply didn't offer enough to differentiate itself from the competition. While it may have had potential, it remains a largely forgotten chapter in British automotive history. The Triumph Herald, produced from 1959 to 1971. The Herald was Triumph's attempt at offering a small family car with a bit of style and flair. With its unique angular design and the option for a convertible, it caught the eye of many buyers who were looking for a fun, affordable car. But while the Herald had some redeeming qualities, it also had a number of significant issues that made it difficult to live with. Let's dive into why the Triumph Herald was both loved and hated, and why it ended up being more of a challenge to own than many anticipated. The Triumph Herald had a bold and distinctive look, with its sharp angular lines and compact proportions. The design was unique for its time, and it definitely set the Herald apart from other small cars on the market. It was offered in a variety of body styles, including a two-door saloon, a four-door version, and perhaps most famously, a convertible. The convertible was particularly popular among those looking for a stylish open-top driving experience at a relatively affordable price. On paper, the Herald seemed like a great little car, with its attractive design and the promise of fun, open-air motoring. However, the Herald's appeal wasn't enough to overcome its significant shortcomings. First and foremost, the Triumph Herald's handling left much to be desired. Despite its sporty appearance, the Herald wasn't particularly enjoyable to drive. The steering was vague and unresponsive, and the suspension was firm to the point of being uncomfortable, as when compared to its competitors, the Herald didn't offer the level of driving satisfaction that many buyers were hoping for. Whether you were cruising along the motorway or navigating tight city streets, the Herald's handling often felt sluggish and uninspiring, making it more of a chore than a joy to drive. But handling wasn't the only problem. The Herald's build quality was another area where it fell short. While some models were built well enough, the quality control during production was inconsistent, leading to cars that varied in terms of fit and finish. This made it hard for many owners to rely on their Heralds, as some cars had issues with panel alignment and interior fittings that didn't always meet expectations. But perhaps the most significant issue the Herald faced was its notorious rust problem. The Triumph Herald was plagued by rust from the very beginning. And this was a problem that only worsened as the years went on. The body panels, undercarriage, and even the floorboards were particularly susceptible to corrosion, especially in damp or salty conditions. The rust issues were so widespread that many Heralds quickly deteriorated, even with regular maintenance. For owners, this meant constant visits to the body shop and the need for frequent repairs to keep the car roadworthy. Rust was such a big issue that the Herald became almost synonymous with it, and many of these cars quickly became unfit for use if left unchecked. And then there was the engine. The Herald was powered by a small, underpowered engine that struggled to provide enough power for the car's size and weight. While the Herald was never meant to be a performance car, the lack of power meant that it wasn't particularly quick or engaging to drive. Whether on the open road or navigating urban traffic, the Herald felt sluggish and lacked the punch that many buyers had hoped for from a car with such a bold design. The engine's lack of power, combined with the other issues with handling and build quality, made the Herald a frustrating car to own for many. I spoke to a few former Triumph Herald owners, and their stories reflect the challenges of owning one of these cars. One former owner said, "I loved the look of the Herald, especially the convertible, but the rust issues were constant. I had to replace panels more than once, and the car was never the same after that. It was fun to drive, but it always felt like something was going wrong." Another owner shared, "The Herald was a cute car, but I could never get over how sluggish it was. The engine just didn't give you enough power, and when you added the steering and suspension issues, it didn't make for a very pleasant driving experience." So, what is the legacy of the Triumph Herald? The Herald is remembered fondly by some for its unique design and its status as a relatively affordable convertible. For a time, it captured the spirit of fun and style at a reasonable price. However, its legacy is marred by significant reliability issues, particularly rust, poor handling, and underwhelming engine performance. While it might be a beloved classic for some, the Triumph Herald is also remembered as a car that was challenging to own thanks to its frequent mechanical and structural issues. In conclusion, the Triumph Herald was a car that had a lot of potential but struggled with some serious flaws. Its distinctive design and the convertible option gave it appeal, but its poor handling,